The Bilbao Masters tournament has started in Bilbao, the capital of the Basque country in Spain. And it's a 6-player double round robin tournament and a very, very intriguing lineup. We have the world champion Magnus Carlsen, and he faces his challenger for the world title in November, Sergei Karyakin. All eyes will be on that one. But he has Carlsen has a couple of needly opponents. Anish Giri, there's been a lot of chat between the two of them, and also Hikaru Nakamura, a feisty opponent for Magnus Carlsen. Apart from that, we have Wesley So, 22 years old, and we have Wei Yi, 17 years old, a young Chinese star. So very interesting lineup. You know, this is really the younger generation. Well, we had a really great matchup in the first round, Magnus Carlsen against Hikaru Nakamura. Now, in classical chess, Nakamura has a dreadful score against Carlsen. Well, according to my records, they've had 18 draws. Magnus has won 12 games and Hikaru has no wins at all. So, not an easy opponent for Nakamura. Let's have a look what happened in the first round. So, Magnus has played knight e2. Now that's a bit of a spin serve. White keeps options open to play d4, but sometimes you can go into a kind of close Sicilian. And it's just a way of finding out exactly what black is going to do here. Well, with d6 and then a6, Nakamura signals his intention to play a Najdorf if, for example, white plays d4. But Carlsen decides to keep the position closed for the moment and fianchettos his bishop g6. Okay, all very normal. And here Carlsen could keep the position closed and play a kind of close Sicilian, where a6, well, it's maybe not the best move. I think this is quite a reasonable way for white to play. But Carlsen decides to open the position, and now they've transposed into a kind of dragon, a fianchetto variation against the dragon, and this is a very standard position. I mean, it has a reasonable reputation for white, but obviously this is not the reputation of the dragon variation. But it's the kind of quite strategic position that Carlsen, I think, would be quite at home with. Here the most normal move is to play h3 to cover the g4 square. That restricts the movements of this bishop and also allows you sometimes to play the bishop to e3 without fearing knight g4. But Carlsen played b3, which is a little bit unusual. This double fianchetto, well, yeah, doesn't look too terrifying. But when I looked in my database and I found that the great Estonian player Paul Keres had played this once against Kavalek and beaten Kavalek in 20 moves, well, perhaps we shouldn't dismiss this. And of course, it's very sensible to solidify your structure on the queen side and put your bishop on a reasonable square. Knight c6 from Nakamura. And here, well, one could perhaps withdraw the knight, but interesting decision from Carlsen to change the pawn structure. Normally, I would frown upon this exchange because the c6 pawn now covers the d5 square, so there's no longer any chance of playing knight d5. But well, Carlsen has an interesting idea in mind. Let's just go on a little bit further. And knight a4, and here we can start to see what what Magnus Carlsen has in mind. First of all, because a6 has been played, then sometimes the b6 square is available for that knight. Also, the knight looks at c5, and sometimes, if not at the moment, but if white can play e5 and exchange pawns, then it means that that knight has the c5 square available, and of course it would open up this long diagonal for the bishop. So that's one of Carlsen's strategic aims, to perhaps get in e5. So yeah, I think already this position is certainly more comfortable for white than black. It's not absolutely clear what black's strategy should be here. I mean, very often when you have this isolated a pawn, you want to run this down the board to exchange it off, but of course that's not possible at the moment. So yeah, I think already a slightly more comfortable position for white. Queen e1, and I think Carlsen, well, clearly he would welcome the exchange of queens, so he wants to play e5, and after knight d7, well, something like f4, bishop is slightly oddly placed here. Pleasant position for white. So Nakamura decides to keep the queens on. So still complicated, but I'm not convinced really about Nakamura's strategy here, because his queen really is pushed to the side. He's not losing anything here, but it is a slightly odd position for the queen, and there is no chance of attacking white's king at the moment. Rook d1, yeah, that just covers d2 square. Rook is good on the semi-open file. These pawns have advanced, but no way of exploiting their advance at the moment. And yes, white perhaps intends to play bishop c1 to attack the queen. So g5, that anticipates bishop c1, and yeah, perhaps gives the queen a square on g6. Here I think white has a few decent moves. I quite like this very simple queen e3, just centralising the knight. Excuse me, centralising the queen. I'm all over the place. Another idea is knight b6. I quite like this. So let's say an exchange of bishops. Now watch out for taking on f6 and a knight d7. So we play rook d8. Now tactically vulnerable loose bishop on b2. So let's put it here where it's protected. White again, I think it just has a more pleasant position. At some moment this knight will come back into play. Not exactly clear what black is up to here. But Carlsen played bishop c1. He has a specific idea in mind. So because of the threats to g5, of course, black has to trade and put the queen on g6. So the queen has well, reached a more stable square, let's put it like that. And now Carlsen plays a very aggressive plan, and this is tied in with this move, bishop c1. He plays h4. Now, he doesn't have to play like this, but, well, it's certainly not bad. And Nakamura exchanges off. I guess he could play h6, but it's very passive. That queen could just be knocked into the corner, or yeah, maybe just the h4, rook to the h file. It doesn't look good. So Nakamura exchanges, and here I think quite a nice plan for white is to put the knight on c4, just re-centralising. And this knight, you know, who knows, it might one day be able to hop over to the king side. It's very important to note that if d5, then knight e5 traps the queen, so black is unable to break out, and then white will take back on h4, and well, yeah, I think Carlsen has certainly a more pleasant position. Always got to watch out for the king being a little bit exposed, but I think in this case white is doing quite well. But Carlsen decides to recapture straight away, and well, it looks very healthy. White seems to have a healthier pawn structure. The queen looks good on h4, but now comes the counter-attack, d5. Now, white is probably still okay in this position if he exchanges on d5, but Carlsen played extremely aggressively here, g5. Now, if you play like this, you have to be absolutely certain of what you're doing. But watch what happens. Nakamura took on e4. Now, of course, the pawn is pinned, so you can't take the knight. But this was Carlsen's intention. He played f4, so he's given up a pawn and wants to just ram forward, and looks extremely dangerous. But Nakamura played e6. Very simple, preventing f5. And now black is a pawn up. And after the game, Carlsen just said, well, he said he overlooked e6. Overlooked is a strong word. I guess maybe just underestimated e6. But from here on in, it is extremely difficult for white to find any decent compensation for this pawn. And from this moment on, Carlsen is really struggling because, well, if you look, it's a classic Sicilian scenario. We have a black king which is under attack from a pawn storm, but if this pawn storm fails, then actually black's king is still very safe, and it's white's king which is exposed because it has no proper pawn cover. So black just has to hold firm, and at some moment you're going to get a hit against the king. Let's see if that comes to pass. Rook d8. So Nakamura, of course, just bringing his rook to the open file. All terribly sensible stuff. Carlsen avoids any potential problems on the d file. What he's worried about, I mean, this looks like a very odd move actually, to duck the challenge on the d file. Problem is he's worried about e3, followed by the queen invading on one of these squares. Of course, well, we can see straight away the tactical problems when you have an exposed king. And e3 is actually very nasty. So this is what this move is directed against. But if you give black a free rein on the d file, then this is obviously terrible. White's strategy is busted here. And this is a very nice maneuver. Knight e8. And the knight hops in and can look at f5, covers the e-pawn, and black has everything under control. And that queen, which was sort of being pushed around, actually is in a very good situation here. It's not in any way vulnerable and can sometimes break through into white's position. f5, good move. Just now we have a protected passed pawn. Very strong. And now Nakamura is very patient here. He doesn't rush it. He doesn't need to. He's simply preparing a big stab against white's structure. So let's see. Let's go on a few moves. So rook's on the d file. Very nice. So really, Carlsen has to trade, but there are always going to be problems on the d file. A check from Carlsen. Black's king much safer than white's, of course. Yeah, if knight takes a6, well then the rook comes in and a queen comes in and just total destruction. Rook f2, vainly attempting to cover the second rank. Queen h5. Carlsen desperate for an exchange of queens. Of course, the ending would still be better for black, but with white's king white's king so exposed, of course Nakamura keeps the queens on the board. And here's an important moment. It's time to start the final assault. Excellent move, e5. So this just undermines white's pawn chain. If this pawn is taken, then rook g6, and this pawn is crumbling. Yeah, of course, if rook takes f5, then queen g4, simple tactics, exposed king once again. Queen g3, rook g6 anyway, and here we go. This is just destroying white's king position. And now a couple of checks just to reach the time control, and which was at move 40 and knight takes g5. So another pawn in the bag, and more importantly, we're just breaking through to white's king, and Carlsen is utterly lost here. He has a few checks. Of course, Nakamura had to calculate and make sure that his king was safe, but in fact there is no danger here. This knight can't contribute to the attack, and this is just a matter of time before white's king suffers a fatal attack. So queen d4, hitting the knight. If queen takes f5, then knight f3 check is winning, hitting this, and rook takes queen g1 check and mate on h1. b4. Now we just need to unpin here, and then we can unleash the beast. And the king is still completely safe because the rook can cover here, as it does now. Rook g8. And once again, this move, knight f3 check. If the king moves, then we can... let me see. You've got to watch out for perpetual in that case. Yeah, king h3. This is what happened. Yeah, you can't take because queen f6 check, and that's perpetual. So that's why Carlsen played Nakamura played queen d6, threatening mate here and threatening mate on h6. I found this a very strange game, to be honest. Carlsen, I think, had a nice opening, and then this pawn sacrifice, advancing the f-pawn, was like a rush of blood to the head, and in one moment he threw away quite a promising position. And after that, well, I think Nakamura played very well. He kept his cool, he was very patient, but really this was a game that was chucked away with one careless move by Carlsen. But Nakamura, of course, was very happy to win his first classical game against Carlsen. It's like a monkey off his back. So after round one, Nakamura leads the tournament. The other two games were draws. But the whole tournament is ahead of us.